Welcome to the very first episode of Not Your History Class podcast. Before this podcast was even a conscious thought in my mind, I always felt like our history education was missing something. Everything just felt a little too clean, a little too neat. And even as a kid, I didn't think that that was realistic. So when I first started talking about bringing this podcast to life, one of my first thoughts was to talk about the first Thanksgiving in the United States. Our teachers led us to believe that the natives and the Pilgrims were sitting down to have a meal as friends, but the truth is much darker, way bloodier, and far more disturbing than we were led to believe. This is the story of the first Thanksgiving. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. The Plymouth colony consisted of Puritans called separatists who decided to leave England to be able to practice their religion freely. The Pilgrims had also signed a contract with the Virginia Company, which was a trading company that King James I had chartered. The main goal was to colonize parts of the East Coast. Stockholders in London had financed the trip with the hope that they would be paid back with the profits from the new settlement. The Mayflower had originally set sail in July 1620, but the ship that they were traveling with, the Speedwell, was leaking. The journey was delayed a couple months and restarted again on September 6, 1620. Due to the weather throwing them off course, they landed in Massachusetts instead of Virginia. American education taught us that the Pilgrims settled in Plymouth, Massachusetts instead of Virginia because the brutal winter was coming, or perhaps a storm had thrown them off course. In the book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, the author James W. Lowen wrote, quote, "Winter's onset could not have been the reason. However, for the weather would be much milder in Virginia than Massachusetts. Moreover, the Pilgrims spent 6 full weeks until December 26th scouting around Cape Cod looking for the best spot." End quote. There is a theory that the Dutch could have bribed the captain to sail north, but there are other theories that ending up in Cape Cod was done on purpose. Lowen went on to write that, quote, "Historian George Willison has argued that the Pilgrim leaders, wanting to be far from Anglican control, never planned to settle in Virginia. They had debated the relative merits of Guyana in South America versus the Massachusetts coast, and according to Willison, they intended a hijacking. Certainly, the Pilgrims already knew quite a bit about what Massachusetts could offer them, from the fine fishing along Cape Cod to that wonderful plague which offered opportunity for English settlement." End quote. There were 102 passengers on the Mayflower, 50 men, 19 women, and 33 young adults and children. Only 41 were considered to be true pilgrims, as they were separatists from the Church of England. Other individuals that came on the journey were common folk, such as craftsmen, merchants, indentured servants, and orphan children, which the Pilgrims labeled them as strangers. Unfortunately, about half the original Pilgrims died in winter on land from the cold, famine, and disease. Since the Mayflower had not landed in Virginia, the strangers felt like the Virginia Company contract was void. They didn't want to recognize the rules since they technically had no official government. Pilgrim leader William Bradford wrote, quote, "Several strangers made discontented and mutinous speeches," end quote. The majority of Pilgrims agreed to create a set of temporary laws. Thus, the Mayflower Compact was born. On November 11, 1620, 41 men and 2 indentured servants signed the accord. The rules were simple. They were as follows. 1. Colonists will remain loyal subjects to King James. 2. Laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices would be created and enacted with the expectation that the colonists would abide by them. 3. One society would be created and they would work together to further it. And 4. They would live their lives in accordance of the Christian beliefs. John Carver was then elected governor on November 21st, 1620, but unfortunately he passed away in April 1621, and William Bradford took over the governor's role. It was then that the Plymouth started to thrive. The Mayflower Compact remained in use until 1691, when Plymouth Colony joined Massachusetts Bay Colony. Before the Europeans arrived to North American shores, the natives didn't experience disease due to poor hygiene, livestock, or overcrowding. Quote, residents of Northern Europe and England rarely bathed, believing it unhealthy, and rarely removed all their clothing at one time, believing it to be immodest, end quote, wrote Lowen. The natives thought that the Pilgrims stunk. According to Squanto's biographer, Feeney Ziner, he, quote, tried without success to teach them to bathe, end quote. 3 years earlier, French and English fishermen searching for fresh water and natives for the slave trade on land had transmitted diseases to the natives. English eyewitness Robert Cushman had said that within those 3 years, the plague wiped out 90 to 96% of the natives living on the New England coast. The ones who survived would then unintentionally spread it to other communities, spreading it to individuals who didn't even encounter Europeans. English separatists took the mass deaths of the natives as a sign from God, and that it meant that they were supposed to take over the land. Lies My Teacher Told Me author Lowen writes, quote, by the time the native population of New England had replenished themselves to some degree, it was too late to expel the intruders. If colonists had not been able to occupy lands already cleared by Indian farmers who had vanished, colonization would have proceeded much more slowly. Indian culture had not been devastated by the physical and psychological assault it suffered. Colonization might not have proceeded at all. End quote. Wamsuda, also known as Frank James, a Wampanoag activist and organizer of the National Day of Mourning, said, quote, the Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod for 4 days before they robbed the graves of my ancestors and stolen their corn and beans. End quote. There have been arguments that the first Thanksgiving took place in Florida in 1565, 60 years before the Plymouth colony was established. A Spanish fleet had landed in St. Augustine. To celebrate their arrival, they shared a meal with the Timucuan people. Although not officially recognized as a national holiday until 1863, it had been used to nationally celebrate victories such as the United States' victory over the British in the Battle of Saratoga, and at the end of the Revolutionary War, as well as the ratification of the Constitution. Both the Confederacy and Union during the Civil War celebrated Thanksgiving after major victories. Thomas Jefferson famously refused to celebrate. He believed in the separation between church and state and believed that by agreeing with these celebrations as president, he would be promoting state-sponsored religious worship. In 1621, the Pilgrims had their first successful harvest. To celebrate, they shot their guns in the air, which had an unintended consequence when the Wampanoag thought they needed to prepare for battle, and about 50 Wampanoag made an appearance at their gate. After realizing there was no battle intentions from the Pilgrims, the Wampanoag joined the feast. They ate deer, corn, shellfish, and roasted meat, and shot other fowl, likely geese and ducks, because turkeys were actually much more difficult to hunt. The natives and Pilgrims all socialized within the next week. The men drank, ran races, and fired guns. The two groups struggled to understand each other through broken English and Wampanoag. This event created a sort of treaty that lasted over 50 years until King Philip's War in 1675 to 1676. King Philip's War was a very bloody conflict in colonial American history. Was also known as the First Indian War, the Great Narragansett War, or Metacom's Rebellion. It was led by Metacom, the Wampanoag chief who would later be known as King Philip. The rebellion lasted 14 months, and it was a last-ditch attempt of the natives to refuse to recognize British rule. Metacom was the second eldest son of Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag. His older brother, Wamsuda, who adopted the English name Alexander, was arrested under suspicion of plotting war. He died during questioning, and Metacom took over the role of chief after his brother passed away. Native Christian John Sassaman warned Plymouth Colony that the Wampanoag was planning to attack. Later that year, in 1675, Sassaman was found dead in an icy pond, apparently of murder. A jury of English colonists found 3 Wampanoag men guilty of the murder. They were hung on June 8, 1675. This incited the natives and thus set the groundwork for King Philip's War. One of the more notable natives on the Europeans' journey to settle in the New World is named Tisquantum, but was given the name Squanto by his friend William Bradford, the second governor of Plymouth Colony. Squanto's name, Tisquantum, was a name he gave himself after he gained maturity. Scholars don't know the meaning behind his name, but agree it has to do something with the great god spirit Manitou, which is referenced in the Algonquin language spoken by the Pawtuxet and other tribes. Squanto was an interpreter and guide for the Pilgrim settlers. He spoke English fairly well because he had been enslaved and taken over to Britain, and there were several different theories about what happened, but the main points are that around 1610, he and several other members of his tribe were taken to Britain by an English captain and slave trader. Squanto worked hard and either won his freedom and escaped, and was able to return to North America about 10 years later, working as an interpreter on a trade mission to modern-day Cape Cod. When he arrived, he found his village, the Pawtuxet tribe of the Wampanoags, decimated by what was likely smallpox. He found only piles of bones and came to the horrifying realization that he was the sole survivor of his tribe. The illness had spread so quickly that the tribe didn't have enough time to bury their dead. The Pilgrims then set up the Plymouth plantation on the site of Squanto's old village. Quote, Squanto's travels acquainted him with more of the world than any pilgrim encountered. He had crossed the Atlantic perhaps 6 times, twice as an English captive, and had lived in Maine, Newfoundland, Spain, and England, as well as Massachusetts. All of this brings us to Thanksgiving. End quote, said Lowen. The Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, thought that the Pilgrims could be their allies against the Narragansett and used Squanto as a translator, although he did not trust him and held him as a prisoner. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag made a treaty that the Pilgrims and the tribe would look out for each other. Squanto, recognizing his power with the English colonists, tried to undermine Massasoit's authority. Massasoit wanting him to be executed, but William Bradford refused. Squanto passed away in 1622, possibly of a fever, but there is speculation that it was poison on Massasoit's orders. This now brings us forward to 1862. The settlers of Minnesota were attempting to forcibly remove the Dakota from their state, including putting them into an internment camp on Pike Island below Fort Snelling. Previously, between 1837 and 1858, the Dakota tribe had signed a series of treaties that would promise them food and money for their land. Simultaneously, the United States was encouraging settlement along the western frontier, including Minnesota becoming a state. Due to the Civil War, meaning that the government had fallen behind on its promises, the Dakota had been without food and provisions and were on the verge of starvation. On August 17, 1862, a Dakota hunting party snuck into Acton Township and stole eggs from settlers. Due to this raid, 5 settlers died. The next day, Little Crow, the leader of the Dakota, decided to continue the raids. The government was slow to send troops due to the war, and so volunteer groups were formed as a makeshift military, led by former Governor Henry Sibley. On September 23rd, the United States military defeated the Dakota at the Battle of Wood Lake. The Dakota surrendered, releasing 300 captives, and they were held at Camp Release near Montevideo until their military trials in November. There were 498 trials, and 300 men were sentenced to death for crimes from rape to murder. The Dakota were not allowed representation, and the trials lasted minutes, sometimes less than 5. This series of battles was called the Dakota War of 1862. At the end of the war, President Lincoln commuted all but 39 sentences, although some sources say 38. Only those who were involved in the civilian massacre would be hanged. The men were hung in Mankato, which historically remains the largest single execution in United States history. The rest of the convicted men were sentenced to Camp McClellan in Iowa, where they were imprisoned for 4 years. Thanksgiving was then established as a national holiday as a weak attempt to mend the hard feelings between the natives and the federal government. The first Thanksgiving wasn't officially established as a national holiday until November 1863 by Abraham Lincoln. The hope was to improve the relationship between the United States and tribal nations, as well as the northern and southern states. The woman who wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb, author and abolitionist Sarah Josepha Hale, had lobbied for years to make Thanksgiving an annual celebration, as she believed it could help heal wounds from the Civil War. She wrote Mary's Lamb in 1830, and she was one of the founders of the American Ladies magazine. In 1835, she was offered the job of editor of Godey's Lady Book, which she stayed at for 40 years. It became one of the most influential publications of its time, and before the Civil War, more than 150,000 copies were sold. It became one of the most successful and influential journals in the country. She also established Vassar College in New York that offered women an equivalent education to what men received at the time. Hale was a huge advocate for women's education. In Godey's Lady Book, she frequently wrote articles about Thanksgiving and lobbied state and federal officials to make it a national holiday. By 1854, more than 30 states and U.S. territories celebrated Thanksgiving. According to an article in 2011 in Indian Country Today, many Native Americans view Thanksgiving as a time for grief. In 1970, the National Day of Mourning, which is held on the last Thursday of November, was established. It happened after the Commonwealth of Massachusetts invited Wamsuta, also known as Frank James, to give a speech on the behalf of the Wampanoag people. James' planned speech was going to talk about how the Pilgrims' arrival in the United States had led to mass deaths. He wanted to speak about the broken promises the settlers had made to the natives. After discovering this information, he was disinvited from speaking. This prompted the National Day of Mourning to be formed. James wrote, quote, "This action by Massasoit was perhaps our biggest mistake. We, the Wampanoag, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end." End quote. Many natives celebrate the National Day of Mourning by traveling to visit the statue of Massasoit in Plymouth, Massachusetts. By 1941, Congress officially established the date as the fourth Thursday in November, as before then, 16 states had refused to change to that date, so Thanksgiving was celebrated on 2 different dates. However, Franklin Roosevelt wanted to extend the shopping season for Christmas. Thanksgiving football games started in 1876 with Yale versus Princeton. In the 1920s, Gimbel's, a department store in Philadelphia, started a parade of about 50 people and had a Santa Claus at the end. Since 1924, Macy's Parade has been held annually and started with huge balloons. I will leave you with this last piece of information of Lincoln's decision to make Thanksgiving a national holiday and to try and mend wounds. Dr. Kelly Mosteller, the director of Citizen Potawatomi Nation's Cultural Heritage Center, said of Lincoln's decision that, quote, "It was propaganda. It was to try and build this event so you could have a deeper narrative about community building and coming together in shared brotherhood and unity. A lot of people don't acknowledge it as Thanksgiving. They say, I'm going to get together with family and it's going to be about sharing the meal, but we aren't going to acknowledge the Mayflower and Pilgrims because it's holding up this false moment of friendship and completely disregards the genocide and the mass land theft and brutality that all Native peoples experience." End quote. Please subscribe to my podcast. And if you are listening on iTunes, please give the podcast 5 stars. It really helps me get out there. I am currently on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and X, so follow me on social media as well. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, production, and editing is done by Lauren Powers. Theme song is done by Mike Meyers, and you can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.